For over 1,000 years, it was the city no one could conquer, Constantinople, fortress of the Byzantine Empire, crowned with towering walls and guarded by the faith of millions. Crusaders, Persians, and countless armies had tried, and all had failed. It was called the Jewel of Europe, the last breath of Rome itself. But in 1453, that reputation would be shattered forever. What force could bring down the most unbreakable city in history, and why did its final days turn into one of the bloodiest collapses the world had ever seen? The last days of Byzantium. By the mid-15th century, the Byzantine Empire was only a ghost of its former self. Once stretching across continents, it had shrunk to a fragile core, with Constantinople as its last jewel. The mighty city that had once housed nearly 800,000 people now sheltered barely 50,000, its grand avenues reduced to fields and empty streets. Emperor Constantine XI knew exactly what was coming. He tried to bargain with Sultan Mehmed II, sending gifts and pleas for peace, but the young ruler wasn't interested. He wanted the city for himself. The gifts were rejected, the diplomats executed, and the message was clear. War was inevitable. Desperate, Constantine turned to the Christian kingdoms of the West. But centuries of division between Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Catholicism had left deep scars. Promises were made, but real help never came. A handful of volunteers, a few dozen ships, and supplies were all that could be spared. In the end, Constantinople stood with only about 7,000 defenders facing an Ottoman army that may have numbered more than 80,000. It looked hopeless, but the city had defied the odds before. Its walls had never been breached by force, and for a moment it seemed like those ancient stones might still hold back the tide. But this time, the Ottomans had a secret weapon, one born from the mind of a man who promised he could bring down even the walls of Babylon. Orban's superweapon. The walls of Constantinople had a reputation. They were legendary, unbreakable, the gold standard of defense for over 1,000 years. But in 1453, the Ottomans brought something new to the battlefield, something that would change the way wars were fought forever. Enter Orban, a Hungarian engineer with a mind as dangerous as any army. He first approached the Byzantines, offering his services, but the empire's treasury was nearly empty. They couldn't afford him, so he turned to Mehmed II, and the young sultan saw an opportunity. Orban promised he could build a cannon so powerful it would blast the walls of Babylon itself. Mehmed took the gamble. The result was a monster, 27 feet of solid bronze, capable of hurling 600-pound stone balls over a mile. Nothing like it had ever been seen before. When it fired, the ground shook. The sound echoed for miles. Even the defenders inside the city were rattled by its thunder. But this so-called superweapon had flaws. It took 3 hours to reload, overheated quickly, and the massive cannonballs were in short supply. Still, its psychological effect was undeniable. For the first time, the defenders began to wonder, could Constantinople's legendary walls really fall? But a cannon alone couldn't bring down a city that had stood for centuries. Mehmed needed more, and soon the siege of Constantinople would begin. The siege begins. On April 2nd, 1453, the Ottoman army arrived before Constantinople. It was a sight that must have chilled the defenders to the bone. As many as 80,000 soldiers, banners fluttering, siege engines rolling into place. Across from them stood only 7,000 men under Emperor Constantine XI, guarding the Theodosian walls, the same walls that had defied centuries of invaders. The Byzantines had done what they could to prepare. Crumbling defenses had been patched, smaller cannons placed along the ramparts, and archers and crossbowmen lined the towers. Even a few primitive firearms, brought by Western volunteers, were added to the fight. Inside the city, priests led processions, urging the people to believe their walls would hold. When the first thunder of Orban's massive cannon echoed across the fields, stone crashed against stone, shaking the very foundations of the city. But the walls didn't crumble. With each long pause as the supergun reloaded, the defenders rushed to repair cracks, patch holes, and brace weak spots. Every blast chipped away, but for weeks the walls stood tall. The siege had begun, and both sides knew this was no ordinary standoff. It was a war of endurance. Yet the fight wasn't only on land. Out on the water, the fate of Constantinople would hang on a single chain. Naval battles and the Great Chain. While the Ottoman cannons roared on land, the sea became its own battlefield. Constantinople had always relied on the Golden Horn, a natural harbor shielded by an extraordinary defense. A massive iron chain stretched across the water's mouth. No fleet, no matter how how large, could simply sail in. On one side, the Byzantines guarded the harbor with just 26 ships, brave but hopelessly outnumbered. Mehmed commanded a fleet nearly 5 times larger, 126 vessels ready to crush the defenders. Yet the chain held firm, blocking any direct assault. Then came the shock that stunned both sides. On April 20th, 4 Christian supply ships, laden with food and soldiers, fought their way through the Ottoman blockade. Against impossible odds, they slipped past Mehmed's war fleet and reached the city's walls. The defenders erupted in celebration, their spirits soaring, while the Sultan's fury nearly boiled over. His own admiral narrowly escaped execution for the humiliation, but Mehmed was no man to be denied. If the chain barred his ships, he would simply go around it. Thousands of soldiers dragged vessels over greased wooden logs across the land itself and lowered them back into the water behind the chain. In one bold stroke, the impenetrable harbor was exposed, and with the chain bypassed, the siege turned bloodier, uglier, and far more personal than ever before. Blood and terror. With the chain bypassed, the battle took a savage turn. The Byzantines, desperate to stop the Ottoman fleet inside the Golden Horn, launched fire ships, small expendable vessels loaded with oil and explosives, meant to drift into enemy lines and turn the harbor into an inferno. But the Ottomans had been warned. Their ships were ready, and the fire attack failed. The defenders lost precious ships, and many of their sailors never made it back to shore. 40 captured Italians fell into Mehmed's hands. To send a message, the Sultan ordered them impaled on stakes within sight of the city's walls. Their screams carried across the water, a brutal reminder of what awaited those who resisted. The Byzantines answered with their own cruelty. On the ramparts, 260 Ottoman prisoners were executed one by one for all to see. Blood ran on both sides, and the siege became not only a fight for survival, but a war of vengeance. The longer it dragged on, the more savage it became. Neither side would yield. Both knew this siege was more than a battle for a city. It was a battle for history itself. But while blood stained the waters, another war was being waged underground, in a deadly game of tunnels and fire, the Underground War. As the clash raged above ground, a hidden battle was unfolding beneath the city's feet. Sultan Mehmed ordered his men to dig tunnels under the massive Theodosian walls. These weren't just escape routes. They were packed with barrels of gunpowder, meant to shatter the foundations and bring the city crashing down from below. But the Byzantines weren't blind to the threat. Among their ranks was a German engineer, Johannes Grant, a man who understood siege warfare as well as any in Europe. Anticipating the Sultan's move, he ordered counter-tunnels to be dug. Soon the darkness below Constantinople echoed with the sounds of picks striking rock, men clashing in cramped shafts, and fire flooding through the earth. Greek fire, a liquid flame that burned even on water, was poured into the Ottoman tunnels, incinerating everything inside. By late May, the defenders captured 2 Turkish officers. Under torture, they revealed the full network of tunnels. Within days, every Ottoman passage was destroyed. For a moment, hope returned to the city. The walls still stood. The underground threat was gone. But hope was a dangerous illusion. Mehmed was running out of time, his army restless, his commanders anxious. Reinforcements from the west could arrive at any moment. If he failed now, he risked losing everything. And so, the Sultan made his choice. One last, all-or-nothing assault. And in the darkness before dawn on May 29th, the final battle for Constantinople began. The final night. Shortly after midnight on May 29th, 1453, the silence shattered. Ottoman drums thundered, horns blared, and wave after wave of soldiers surged toward the battered Theodosian walls. For nearly 2 months, the mighty cannons had pounded the city's northwest defenses, leaving them cracked and weakened. Now Mehmed unleashed everything. The first assaults were brutal, but repelled. The defenders, exhausted, starving, but determined, threw back the attackers with arrows, stones, and sheer grit. At the heart of the defense was Emperor Constantine XI himself, sword in hand, refusing to abandon his men. For a moment it seemed the city might survive. Then disaster struck. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander leading the city's defense, was gravely wounded. As he was carried from the walls, panic rippled through his troops. The Genoese abandoned their posts, retreating toward the harbor. The gap they left was fatal. Ottoman forces surged through the breach, overwhelming the last defenders. What became of Constantine XI remains a mystery. Some say he died fighting on the walls, unrecognizable among the slain. Others whisper that Seeing defeat was inevitable, he ended his own life. Whatever the truth, he was the last emperor of Byzantium. By dawn, the banner of the crescent flew over Constantinople. The city that had stood for over 1,000 years was no more. But the fall of the city was not the end of the nightmare. It was only the beginning. The aftermath. When the walls finally broke, Constantinople was delivered over to chaos. Mehmed rewarded his soldiers with 3 days of looting, and what followed was horror on a scale the city had never seen. Palaces, churches, and homes were stripped bare. Treasures gathered over centuries vanished into the hands of the conquerors. The people fared far worse. Thousands were cut down in the streets, while countless others, men, women, and children, were herded away as slaves. The Hagia Sophia, once the greatest church of Christendom, echoed not with hymns, but with the cries of the captured. And yet, when the 3 days were over and the fury of his army had burned itself out, Sultan Mehmed walked through the ruined city. Witnessing the destruction, he is said to have wept, whispering, "What a city we have given over to plunder and destruction." The Byzantine Empire was gone, its final breath snuffed out. But in its place, a new power had risen. Constantinople became Istanbul, the heart of the Ottoman Empire, and the fall of the city marked not just the end of an age, but the beginning of a new world. Conclusion. The fall of Constantinople was more than the loss of a city. It was the closing of one chapter in history and the explosive opening of another. For over 1,000 years, it had been the shield of Europe, the bridge between East and West, and the last echo of Rome's empire. Its fall in 1453 reshaped the world. Trade routes shifted, empires rose, and the balance of power changed forever. But behind the dates and battles lies a deeper question. Could Constantinople have been saved if the West had sent more aid, or was its fall inevitable given the empire's long decline and Mehmed's relentless ambition? One thing is certain. On that morning of May 29th, the world woke to a new reality. The Byzantine Empire was no more, and the Ottomans now stood at the gates of Europe. So what do you think? Was the fall of Constantinople destiny, or a tragedy that could have been avoided? Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed diving into the dramatic story of Constantinople's fall, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into the moments that changed history forever. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Constantinople's fall was inevitable, or could it have been prevented? Let's talk about it below.